That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
In 2025, America found itself on the brink of economic shock, and all because of one decision. Amazon, a company that had been considered the pride of the American economy for decades, decided to leave the US and move its headquarters outside the country. Why did the giant that once changed the face of global trade suddenly make such a radical decision? It all started with a new round of trade wars that unfolded after record tariffs were imposed on Chinese goods. Trump said the new policy was supposed to bring jobs back to America, but instead it started to destroy the country's biggest companies.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
Faced with this barrier, Amazon found itself in a tough spot. It was getting harder to keep prices the same when tariffs on Chinese goods went up. But what happened next turned everything upside down. Amazon tried to avoid accusations of raising prices due to the new tariffs, but instead found itself at the center of a scandal. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt discussed this directly with Trump, stating that raising prices on goods threatened not only the interests of Americans, but also national security. Amazon's problems were just beginning, and in Seattle, among other places, people began to notice something strange. Night shifts were being cut, workers were losing confidence, and uncertainty reigned within the company.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
But that was only the beginning. By June 2025, Amazon unexpectedly announced that it was moving its headquarters outside the US, and rumors about where its new offices might be located began to spread rapidly. Why did Amazon, despite its long-standing commitment to the US, decide to move to Singapore, Ireland, or even the UAE? The reasons lie in new tariffs that have deprived the company of its competitive advantage and in the conditions of a global trade war that have forced Amazon to seek access to more lucrative markets. The tariffs hit Amazon hard, while competitors such as Chinese companies gained an unprecedented advantage. But the White House's response was swift and fierce. Trump accused Amazon of betraying American interests, and a political storm erupted. The White House press secretary said the move undermined the US economy and sent the wrong signal to the world. In response, the company offered to show additional costs on its products to avoid accusations of price increases. But at what cost to the company itself?
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year, in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
Amazon was not only losing its reputation in its home country, but economic problems were also beginning in Seattle itself. Where will this lead in the future? Will the company be able to regain its market position? Or will this move spell the beginning of the end for one of the most ambitious projects in American business? In this video, we reveal all the details of the crisis that nearly destroyed Amazon and changed the future of the US economy.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
Amazon, one of the largest companies in the world, found itself at the center of a fierce confrontation with the Trump administration. It all started when the US president decided to increase tariffs on goods, which instantly affected Amazon and other large corporations. The company, which Americans have come to see as an integral part of their economy, is now under intense scrutiny. The problems began when Amazon tried to avoid accusations that it would be forced to raise prices on its products. For Trump, who was already known for his tough stance on foreign trade practices, any deviation from the original plans to lower tariffs was perceived as a threat. Amazon's response was insignificant. The company decided to introduce additional costs for goods, which of course provoked a fierce reaction from the White House.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
The US president was extremely dissatisfied with this turn of events. In response to Amazon's announcement of plans to increase prices for goods due to the new tariffs, Trump publicly expressed his outrage, claiming that this undermines the interests of American consumers. He accused the company of trying to pass on the consequences of trade sanctions to ordinary Americans instead of looking for ways to adapt to the new conditions. The situation in the White House was exacerbated when Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt discussed with the president how Amazon's move could affect the US's image on the international stage. She expressed concern that such a measure could have negative consequences for the country in the eyes of other states, especially those with which the US has trade relations. Leavitt warned Trump that Amazon's actions could be perceived as a sign of weakness in the US economy, which would only serve to further damage the country's international reputation.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
However, despite the White House's concerns, Amazon continued to insist on its position. The company understood that the tariffs introduced in early 2025 would create new economic problems that would not be easy to solve without raising prices. In desperation, the company's management tried to find ways to optimize operations to at least partially offset the additional costs. But American consumers, who had always enjoyed Amazon's products at competitive prices, were not willing to tolerate price increases, and this immediately sparked a wave of discontent. Accusations against the company became inevitable, and all this put additional pressure on Amazon amid political tensions within the country.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
Shortly after these events, the situation at Amazon's headquarters in Seattle began to change. Work shifts at the plant were reduced, and employees noticed a strange silence as the company's offices emptied out at night. Some employees who had previously worked late into the night were now leaving early, giving the impression that the company was losing its former confidence in its abilities. Unsurprisingly, at such times, the company's internal problems began to spill over into open discussions among top managers. The economic instability caused by trade tariffs became even more pronounced when Amazon was forced to cut working hours to reduce costs. Against this backdrop, Amazon's global leadership made one of the most drastic decisions in its history to move its headquarters outside the United States. This decision was the result not only of political pressure from the US government, but also of the global trade war that Trump had launched against several major world economies. Amazon, which found itself at the center of this conflict, realized that remaining in the US under such conditions was becoming increasingly unprofitable. Tighter tariffs and tax conditions made it impossible to remain competitive in the American market. However, the decision to relocate the headquarters did not come as a surprise to those who had been following the situation at the company. Internal signals had long warned that global management was considering moving its business to more stable regions.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
One of the biggest losses for Amazon was the abandonment of the de minimis rules, which allowed the company to avoid paying duties on low-value goods. This move was a turning point. The rule, which had long protected small and medium-sized purchases, was now abolished, making Amazon's prices less attractive compared to its competitors. This move affected not only the company's finances, but also the overall picture on the global market. Amazon began to lose customers, and foreign competitors, such as Chinese and European companies, quickly filled the niche that had previously been secured by the American giant. In a short period of time, the company found itself in a difficult situation with no obvious way out.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
Meanwhile, the economic consequences began to be felt around the world. The US economy found itself in a state of instability as major companies began to leave the country, leading to job losses and a deterioration in the investment climate. In Seattle, where Amazon's headquarters were located, economic problems began. As Amazon began to lay off employees and redirect funds to new operations, a wave of layoffs began, which affected the labor market. Seattle, which had long prided itself on its technology industry, lost its economic foundation, and many local businesses faced difficulties. The situation became increasingly tense, and economists began to predict long-term consequences that could not be remedied by political measures alone. Against this backdrop, new details began to emerge about Amazon's future and its plans for the global market. The company began actively training its engineers in the Persian Gulf countries in an attempt to minimize labor costs and make its operations more efficient. In turn, its competitors such as Apple, Tesla, and Walmart began lobbying for the tariffs to be lifted, realizing that if they could not adapt to the changed political situation, they would face the same fate. As a result, Amazon's departure became not only an economic but also a political statement of corporate independence, which sent an important signal to other major global players. Now, when the question of the significance of American companies in the global economy is acute, Amazon's future in America remains uncertain. And while the company continues to operate in international markets, the question that remains open is how deeply Amazon's departure will affect the US economy and whether it will prompt other companies to follow suit. After Amazon officially confirmed the relocation of its headquarters outside the US, the situation in the country began to deteriorate rapidly. This move not only caused a storm in the White House, but also triggered a wave of economic and social consequences that affected not only the company itself, but also broader sections of the American economy. Economists and political analysts began to seriously discuss what would happen if other large companies followed Amazon's example. For the first time in a long time, the question of the American identity of large corporations became relevant. What does it mean to be an American company if you no longer operate in the United States, if your jobs are leaving the country, and your tax payments are going to other regions? The reaction to Amazon's actions was mixed. Senators, especially those who supported Trump's policies, began to demand an investigation. They accused Amazon of undermining US economic interests and of using its market advantages against the interests of American citizens. Against the backdrop of these accusations, a real political storm began. Headlines appeared in the media, calling the move a betrayal of US interests. Trade unions and public organizations intensified their criticism, accusing the company of effectively betraying the jobs and industry that had made it so successful. However, many analysts noted that Amazon had been forced to make such decisions due to the intolerable conditions created by political decisions, such as tariff increases and the repeal of the de minimis rules. A period of tension began within the company. Faced with anger from the government, Amazon began to publicly defend itself, saying that the move was a necessary step in response to economic pressure and changes in global trade. However, critics of this move had a different opinion. They argued that Amazon did so not only because of tariffs, but also because the Trump administration's global trade policy had indeed forced the company to seek more favorable business conditions. The absence of taxes in the Persian Gulf countries and the lack of duties on imported goods proved to be a decisive factor for a company that could not afford to continue paying high tariffs, especially when its competitors in other countries enjoyed significant economic benefits. Over time, the consequences for Seattle became apparent. After the news of the headquarters move became official, the city began to experience serious economic problems. Seattle, which had always prided itself on being home to tech giants such as Amazon and Microsoft, began to lose its appeal to other companies. Amazon-related jobs began to disappear, affecting not only those who worked directly at the headquarters, but also many small businesses that depended on large orders and partnerships with giants such as Amazon. In the first few months after the company announced its move, Seattle saw a record number of layoffs and local business closures, which was the first link in a chain reaction. However, despite the obvious economic consequences, Amazon's stock reacted surprisingly calmly to the situation. On the day the headquarters move was announced, the company's shares fell 5%, but within a few weeks they began to recover. The market apparently saw this as a temporary setback that the company would be able to overcome. This did not mean that everything would return to the way it was before. On the contrary, Amazon realized that it would have to build a new business model focused on global markets and undergo significant changes. The company began to actively work on improving its internal structure, creating new jobs in the Persian Gulf countries, and continued to duplicate its data and invest in new engineering talent in these regions. It was clear that the future would not be the same for Amazon, and the company was entering a new era of globalization and multi-channel retailing. Meanwhile, the situation with other American companies was becoming increasingly alarming. After Amazon made its move, other large corporations such as Apple, Tesla, and Walmart began actively lobbying for the removal of tariffs and a reduction in economic pressure. For these companies, whose business models also depended on global trade, the tariff situation became a real threat. Some of them began to review their overseas supply structures to reduce their dependence on the US market and lessen the impact of government duties on their products. Amazon's example sent a powerful signal, and it became clear to many corporations that remaining in the US under such conditions could be too risky. Amazon's departure from the US was a statement of corporate independence. The company showed that maintaining its efficiency and profitability was more important to it than its commitment to the policies of a particular country. This was not just an economic decision, but also a political signal to all other global players who may face similar problems in the future. Amazon's departure has become a real marker for other large corporations, which may also seek more favorable conditions for their operations in other countries. But it is worth noting that Amazon's departure not only raised questions about the future of American corporations, but also posed difficult questions for the US. What does it mean to be an American company in the 21st century, when the world has become so globalized? Can companies remain committed to their country if the government's economic policies hurt them? The questions that arose after Amazon's departure have become fundamental to the discussion, not only for the business world, but for society as a whole.